Hi, my name's Jacob Jones, and this is my Practical Musicianship 2 Examination Appraisal. Student number 17542901. The genres that we covered in lectures included jazz, Latin, fusion, funk, and rock. In jazz, we mainly looked at pieces from the real book, such as Watermelon Man, Cantaloupe Island, Oleo, various things that would just increase our knowledge of chords, walking bass lines, and how to solo over them. For Latin, we mainly looked at rhythmical devices, such as the 3-2 clave, certain types of Latin dance like samba and bossa nova. We studied a lot of bossa nova, including blue bossa, out of the real book again. Whereas in a genre like fusion, we studied a lot of Stevie Wonder and Weather Report, mainly just to see how Jaco influenced and developed his very melodic bass style. The funk we looked at was very James Brown heavy, just to give you an idea of how to play funk in a minor key, just to really lock in with the drummer and lock in with a kick. And in the final genre we looked at rock, we looked at playing with a plectrum as well. An area we spent a lot of time looking at in lectures was sight reading, reading both bass and treble clef, recognising certain rhythms and patterns, looking at the melody and looking at the harmonic structure. This has probably been one of the most useful things we've looked at, just because learning to sight read is so helpful, not only to get an idea of what to play, but also just to see what other people have written and just to steal some of those ideas for yourself to use in your own music. Also, it's quite useful to be able to read treble clef as a basis, just so you can read the melody line, and then if you're put on the spot to do a solo, you can just steal it and you play the melody for a bit, and then once you've got an idea of what you're doing, you can develop your own solo. We also spent a lot of time looking at soloing and walking bass lines. The reason I put these two together is because they both help you learn the entire fretboard and to learn where the notes are that you need to play at that time. And also because when you're learning walking bass lines, it helps with your soloing, and when you're learning soloing, it helps with your walking bass line. With the walking bass lines, one of the most important things I learned was to just emphasize the 2 and 4 and really just keep driving the groove. And as long as you've got the 2 and 4, even if you only play roots or fifths in the rest of the walking bass line, it'll sound okay. Walking bass line also helps you learn your chord tones and the keys, so if you know what key you're in and you know what chords you're playing, you can just play the whole thing and you'll know whether to go to the flat 7 or the 5th or things like that. We also looked at chromaticism and playing out in a walking bass line, which can also be used in a solo just to create tension, and when you finally resolve it back to the 5th or any chord tone, especially the root, it just resolves the whole bass line. With soloing, we learn to develop motifs and start off either going all in at once at the start of your solo or developing a tiny idea into a big one that develops over time and gives a sense of journey. We did look at modes and scales when playing these, such as like the minor blues scale or just playing a Dorian over a minor chord, and other altered scales just so you have tension and release in your solo. We're also taught to leave a lot of space in your solo, which actually makes it sound more musical even though you're playing less notes. Because it doesn't matter how fast you play something, if it sounds robotic, then no one wants to hear it. So leaving a lot of space has been one of the best things I've learned to do in my soloing. We also learned various rhythmical devices such as the 3-2 and the 2-3 clave, especially in Latin music and bossa novas. It's all over the place. We learnt triplets and different time signatures as well. For example, the 12/8 time signature in Isn't She Lovely by Stevie Wonder. This has been really useful when sight reading, because we've had sight reading lessons where something's come up in 5/8, and there have been times when only the bassists have known how to play it correctly, just because we've been looking at different time signatures compared to the rest of the class. We've also looked at chord tones, which relates back to soloing and walking bass lines, but we've looked at the root 3rd, 5th and 7th, when to play them and when not to play them, and also extended chord tones such as the 9th, 11th and 13th, which you see quite a lot in jazz, and you might not think to play on a bass, but sometimes it can be a really tasteful move just to play the 11th up higher, just to push the guitar or whatever. We've also learned different modes, so like Dorian relates to a 2 minor chord in the degree, or playing a minor chord for the sixth and the relative major and things like that. For the examination itself, I picked 4 pieces to play. The first one was Rhythm of Love by Anita Baker, the second one was River People, the third one was Cello Suite No. 1 Prelude in G major, and the fourth one was a looped piece of Giant Steps by John Coltrane. These pieces were all pieces that I felt would challenge me. The first one, Rhythm of Love, was a control piece by my lecturer, but the other 3 were suggested to me, and I think they've really helped push my technique. Even if I couldn't execute them perfectly on the exam, they've still helped my technique massively, and I'll still continue to practice them just to improve my playing. The first song I did for my piece was Rhythm of Love by Anita Baker. This song was released in the mid-90s and is an R&B/soul piece. The song is around 6 minutes long and has a BPM of roughly 90 beats per minute. The most challenging parts about this song are the offset rhythm. There's quite a lot of 8th note rests, so you've got to make sure that you get the syncopated rhythms right. And the length of the notes, how long they're held for, that's quite difficult to master as well. Since the piece was given to us as a control piece and to test our sight reading, it was imperative that you got the nuances of the piece down well, which I think I did quite well, and I also executed the rhythms just as well. I had practiced this piece so much that I knew exactly where the changes of the piece were and what chord changes there were, and if there were any stabs, like at the end of the bridge for the example. This meant that I could spend less time worrying about where I was and just making sure I got the nuances as well as I could, even though I didn't get them all perfect, as I didn't sight read the piece perfectly. To improve on this piece, I could work on my sight reading a lot more, and that would just help me recognise more complex rhythms and read more complex lines. This would have helped me a lot more as well when deciding where to play certain notes, because if I read a C-sharp chord, I didn't know exactly whether to play it on the low B on my 5-string or just play it as you would on a regular 4-string guitar. So reading the actual notes and looking at the melody would help. Also, the last thing I could have improved on this piece was to add maybe a few fills at the end when the song's fading out and it's just settling down and the vocals are fading out, because there's not much variation in the bass line at all, and it would have just maybe shown I was capable of playing some fills instead of just playing the same thing over and over again. Overall, I'm pretty pleased with how this piece turned out and played out in the assessment. The second song I performed in my recital was River People by the band Weather Report. It was released in 1978 and was written by the bassist in the band, Jacob Pastorius. The bassist, Jaco, he normally plays a fretless bass, so to play this piece on a fretted bass presented the challenge of just trying to get the tone that you would out of a fretless bass. The piece is very fast moving, it's a lot of octaves, and it requires a very good double fingering technique, because you have to play 16th notes across 3 strings, which is incredibly difficult and took me a lot of time to practice and get up to speed. As with all Jaco pieces, the piece is a very melodic piece for a bass line. It's all over the fretboard, it's very fast, it's very difficult, and there are a lot of weird intervals. Like I mentioned before, I had excellent double fingering technique to be able to play the fast 16th notes precisely, making sure that I wasn't hitting strings in between, especially on my 6th string. My muting technique had to be perfect just so I wouldn't hit any other strings and have them ringing out underneath whilst playing the actual notes. The song itself starts off quite simply. There's just a quarter note rest and then the bass line starts, and it only goes between 2 notes and then 4 notes at the start, but it quickly develops over time, so you have to keep up with the music itself and make sure you're sight reading so you know where you are, because it's quite easy to lose track, because if you miss one note you've lost the whole piece. There are some especially hard intervals in the chorus, if you like, where he plays a 5th and then he plays a 5th on top of that, so it spans across 5 frets at the bottom end of the fretboard, so the fret distance is incredibly wide and it's quite tough on your hands to make sure you play it accurately and up to speed as well, and you don't miss any of those notes. So I executed those wells, and I also had a very good tone. I'd rolled all the treble up and I was playing near the bridge just to get that really honky tone. That was typical of Jayco's fretless bass of doom. I also played the outro very well. It's a very fast 16th note rhythm that rests for like 2/16th notes and then it's back into it again and it just repeats. And to make sure you have the stamina for that and to count through it so you know when the rest is very difficult, but I got through it and I practiced it quite a lot. That was probably one of the things I practiced most for the assessment, just so I could just get it right. Unfortunately, because this piece is like 4.5 minutes long and it's a very fast BPM and there's a lot of 16th notes, stamina plays a very key part. I did keep most of my stamina throughout the song and I didn't misplay that many notes, but at some point in the middle my hand was getting numb and I didn't get the rhythmic placement as correct as it should have been. But I just had to tell myself to just relax a bit and it soon locked back in. So the only thing I could improve with that is just to practice my stamina more, so when it comes time I don't have to lose my place again and it'll be fine. My muting technique, whilst pretty good, wasn't absolutely perfect. There were some times when my low B rang out and I just had to mute it quickly. So that's definitely something I could also improve upon with every song, not just River People. Overall, I was pretty pleased with how the song went. I think it's probably the best song I played. Was just in terms of execution, it was the one I'd practiced the most and it was the one I played the best. The third piece I performed for my recital was the Cello Suite No. 1 Prelude in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach. This piece was written centuries ago for cello and is a very difficult piece because even though its 16th notes is quite slow, it's more about the dynamics rather than the speed. I found this piece very difficult, which I believe to be down to two things. Firstly, a lack of practice. I definitely could have practiced it more and I will continue to just to improve my technique, but also down to the fact that the piece was written for cello, which is tuned in fifths, whilst modern electric bass guitar is tuned in fourths, so the intervals are much wider for the fretting hand than they would be on cello. The open tuning of the strings also isn't the same, so in some parts he uses an open string and then a fretted note just to create intervals, but on bass guitar you have to fret both of those and you can't use the note as an open string because you don't necessarily have it as an open string, which results in it being a difficult piece to play on bass guitar. I think I executed the dynamics of the first page very well, which I knew quite well, and I definitely got all the little nuances in that I wanted to. And I also had good technique to play the piece on bass guitar, not cello. However, on the second page, I lost my place twice in the recital, and I also played the last chord incorrectly twice as well, because I played it a tone down, because I think it was just nerves. I just looked at the wrong fret or something, I just hadn't got it right. To improve on this, I could definitely learn the piece thoroughly and make sure I know where every part of it is and listen to other people play it on cello and just see what dynamics they use, as well as where they put accents on things as well, which would just make the piece I played more musical and not so robotic and just off-tempo. To improve on this piece, I could definitely learn the piece again and just make sure I really nail it, but just to learn other classical music as well, because I haven't had that much exposure to it, and in hindsight learning it has actually really helped with my technique, just because it's not like music today. It's just so different, the intervals and just the tempo, and it's more about the dynamics and just the instructions written on the sheet that is really difficult to master, and it's something I will look into just to improve overall. The last piece I performed in my recital was Giant Steps by John Coltrane. This piece came out in the 1960s and is a very fast jazz piece. The original version is 260 beats per minute and is 4 minutes and 43 seconds, but seeing as I could not perform this piece that fast, I decided to loop it and perform it at a slower rate. The piece is renowned for being incredibly difficult, changing key every 3 chords or so. The fact that it changes key so many times is what makes it difficult, because the chords themselves are just simple 2-5-1 progressions, but because it changes key by a major third every now and then, it becomes incredibly hard to solo over. Not only were these chord changes hard to memorize, but they were very difficult to play as well, and I couldn't have done it without my sixth string. Getting the timing right of the looper as well was very difficult, but I did manage to loop it around once and then play the bass line immediately afterwards, which was very difficult to do, as I had to press it and play the first note of the bass line after playing the chords through once. I then began to play the head of the song twice and started soloing thereafter. With my solo, I managed to keep in the key most of the time because I had practiced it a lot and I knew where the chord changes were. Even though I knew where the chord changes were, it was still difficult to play a solo that sounded musical and create an idea or a motif with dynamics and still remain in key, because there's a lot to think about. However, I did do okay on this because I researched into the song, and John Coltrane most of the time was just playing the first few degrees of a scale anyway, so it's just a simple rising arpeggio of the key that he's in, and then he switches, but he does it a lot better than I do. To finish the piece off, I played the head once more, and then I stopped the looper and played the first chord of the progression, which is a B major 7 chord. I think the piece lasted around 4 minutes long, with my solo and everything included. There were many things I could improve upon, the first being learning the key changes even more perfectly and work on my soloing too to produce a much better solo. I've read online that if you picture all the chords and all their inversions on the fretboard, it'll make picturing where the notes are in each key a lot easier, so that would probably be a good way to better imagine where the notes are on the fretboard to play for a better solo, as knowing where the notes are would make it easier, so I could just focus more on making it musical rather than just in key. The second thing I could have improved upon was to increase the tempo to make it more impressive, as the original piece is around 260 BPM and I think I only did it around 80 or something measly like that. This will just come with more practice though, as I practice the piece more and more, which I will continue to do so, as it's very challenging and helps me learn different scales like altered scales and bebop scales. Another possibility I discussed with my lecturer when floating this idea around in lessons was to tap the whole piece, so use both hands on the fretboard, so play the walking bass line with the left hand and then the chords with the right hand, or the melody, etc. This would be really challenging, but I think it would be great fun to practice, and also it would be another great technique just to have in the bag just in case I need to whip out something impressive. My practice regime currently is pretty solid. I aim for 2 hours a day, which I don't always achieve, but I always get at least an hour in. Things I do in my practice include sight reading. I always do at least 10 minutes, because after about 10 minutes you get bored of it, but the first 10 minutes, as long as I do it every day, it keeps it up and improves it. I also look at scales, modes, chords, soloing over chord changes, which I sometimes do with like a piece of music, just to make sure my soloing's up to scratch and to improve it and play with different ideas of playing like an altered scale over the 5 chord or whatever and things like that, just to make sure I'm always pushing myself to become a better bassist. I've also started practicing playing out of key and playing over the bar to get that really sort of super jazz vibe of just playing bebop and things like that, especially inspired by like Snarky Puppy, where it sounds so out of key but then it just resolves, so I've been trying to practice that as well. I also practice a lot of technique, including stamina, fingerstyle, and muting. Muting's especially important with the instrument I play, where I play a 6-string bass, because if you strike one string and you hit another, it just doesn't sound good. You need to make sure what you're playing is the only thing you're playing, and when you're playing nothing can be heard at all, because if you've just got a string ringing out and you're supposed to be quiet, it doesn't sound good at all. Improvements to be made to my practice regime, I think, could be to practicing my slap technique, as well as learning to double thumb, because I've seen a lot of people do that, and I think it'd be a really good technique to have, because I can't do it at the minute, but I probably will do in the future. I could also practice more licks and fills, as always, just to put into my playing, but the reason I'm not practicing that at the minute is just I tend to just improvise those licks and fills. I don't just play a set one, I just play something in the key that I know will sound okay, rather than try and do that, which is why I should probably practice them, just to make sure I can play a really complex lick that I've practiced before. overall, I'm pleased with how the practical musicianship module has gone. The exam went fine. I could have done a lot better, but also I could have done a lot worse. I'm glad with the amount of effort I put in, how it went. I'm pleased with that. Thanks for listening.